Lisa, I know you've been talking to sources surrounding what might happen. What have they told you?
I think, Katie, I want to be careful because a number of those sources spoke to MSNBC off the record about what might happen. But I think we should take the former president and the future president at his word with respect to the January 6th defendants and convicts. And, to Tim's point about seditious conspiracy being a line, I'm not sure that in fact is the line. When I think about the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers who were convicted of those crimes, there was planning for violence, but there wasn't an actual engagement in violence by most of those folks. The line that might be drawn here is one about what did you do on the Capitol grounds that day. And if you were a person who, for example, was a mere trespasser, or even if you dressed up in costume, for example, like Jacob Chansley, and sort of terrorized people just by your presence, but, went on the Senate days, or you rappelled down the Senate gallery, that might not be enough to constitute a violent act in the minds of some folks affiliated with the future Department of Justice.
Welcome to the Ken Harbaugh Show. We got Kris Goldsmith back. Kris, add to the long list of worries about this incoming Trump administration and what it's going to do to America. Most of the focus has been on the appointments, and that's probably where most of the focus should be. But I know you're thinking about the crimes that have been committed that we were successfully holding people accountable for. And now there's this idea of blanket pardons for January 6th insurrectionists. How does that make you feel?
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating to see that people who committed violence against police are lionized by the Trump movement. These are the people who say that everyone ought to stop resisting, and they believe in stop and frisk, right? They believe in the use of force by police unless and until it's about protecting democracy, which is about as un-American as you can get. To see fascist thugs, the American version, the modern American version of Hitler's brown shirts or Mussolini's black shirts, being treated as heroes, being called hostages, being called political prisoners by the man who was just elected to be our next president, is profoundly disturbing. And it is a tremendous level of disrespect, I think, for everyone who's ever served in uniform in this country.
And it's not just unjust, because it is letting off people, if this ends up happening, who, in my opinion, some of them deserve to be locked up forever. But it's not just the injustice of that. It's the signal it sends to the next wave of extremists and potential insurrectionists that as long as they're loyal to the right person, they can do anything they want.
Yeah, Donald Trump has verbally endorsed political violence since he stepped onto, the stage and started speaking at his rallies and talking about individuals in the crowd that he hopes get assaulted, right? So at the level of these people tried to bring our democracy to an end. They tried to install a dictator. We shouldn't, talk about this as a riot. It was not a riot. It was a planned insurrection that Donald Trump assisted and aided and was never held accountable for, not in the courts, not by the Senate during his impeachment, and ultimately not by the last judge and jury, that is the voters of the United States. It is profoundly disappointing, and beyond the intellectual exercise that we're going through, it's a sign of dangerous days to come, because Donald Trump explicitly endorsing, condoning political violence done in his name sends a signal to all of these extremist organizations that have been, engaging in violence, threatening violence, intimidating poll workers, sending threats to governors and secretaries of state around the country. It's giving them a green light to go further. And this is ultimately going to get Americans killed.
It's that condoning of violence that I think sets this apart from any historical analog I can think of. I mean, in legal theory, there's this idea that the pardon has associated with it an element of forgiveness. this idea that you've either done your time or you were unjustly convicted, or for the crime you committed, we forgive you. Maybe the sentence was way too high for like possession of marijuana or something like that. That's not the case here. Mm-hmm. What's happening here is an endorsement of their violent activities. And I mean, that's not entirely new in the history of pardons, but if this is done in a wholesale way, it actually is entirely new in the history of pardons for violent actions against police officers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Donald Trump, during his last presidency, used the pardon power to excuse his friends who did try to sabotage our elections in 2016 and in 2020. I think about Steve Bannon, I think about Roger Stone, I think about Mike Flynn. These are all people who were involved in the 2020 and 2021 insurrection and Stop the Steal movement. He has already shown what he is willing to do. That, yeah, the change will be now he's endorsing terrorists. Remember, what does terrorism mean? It is the threat of violence or the use of violence to achieve political ends, right? These people are terrorists, even if the Justice Department is not brave enough to use the definition that's in the law. They are terrorists, and Donald Trump is talking about releasing them. He's been promising this for months, and I'm not going to be surprised if he does. Two
of the ringleaders of the actions on that day, even though they weren't inside the Capitol, Enrique Tarrio and Stuart Rhodes of the Oath Keepers, they have been lionized. Even among the J6 martyrs and political prisoners, they've sort of risen to the top. Would you put it past this administration to go beyond the pardon and honor them in some other way, or God forbid, give them some kind of deputization or official position?
So I've been involved in, as you know, wargaming and scenario planning. One of the scenarios that I wrote up, a few months ago, when a bunch of people thought that Kamala had it in the bag and that she was going to win and Trump winning wasn't realistic at all. One of the scenarios that I prepared was that Donald Trump pardons all of the insurrectionists on January 20. And as a result, Democrats refuse to sit down to go for the State of the Union next year. And that Donald Trump decides that he's going to fill their seats with insurrectionists so that he has a packed House floor. This is a realistic thing. When I first ran it by the organization that I prepared this for, they thought it felt really unrealistic, but I expect something like that to happen. Donald Trump is a showman more than anything, and he's a strong man. Doing stunts like that, giving these people something like the Presidential Medal of Freedom, is absolutely something that he and his lackeys around him would consider, because they do want to turn this outrage that we feel into something that motivates their base. And we will watch a compliant press normalize it. And we'll certainly see Fox News, treat these people like heroes, right? That's nothing new. But we've already seen guys like Jeff Bezos, one of the richest people in the world, stepping back and complying in advance, right? So I think that we are going to see things that right now people might imagine to be absolutely absurd, like it couldn't be on Veep. But we lived through 4 years of Trump being president, and it was always that absurd. So yeah, I expect exactly that.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Quick break here to let you know that we'd love to hear from you. Your comments, suggestions, thoughts about future topics and guests. Email us at info@thekenharbaughshow.com, and make sure to rate and review us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, and back to the show. It is a surreal moment, especially for guys like you, and I will I will put myself in this category just for the sake of this question, to think back 9 months ago when we were setting up these tabletop exercises or war game scenarios, offering up hypotheticals that most people around us were saying were crazy, like RFK for HHS secretary, or a Fox personality for Secretary of Defense. And I feel like a lot of people, or not enough people, were listening. And Stuart Stevens makes this observation that our main failing is the inability to imagine the worst. It's just a lack of imagination, and we got to find a way to get past that.
Yeah, man, I would love to have a follow-up conversation with the writer from The Atlantic who wrote about that tabletop exercise. I'd like to see if he wants to eat his hat, because he seemed to think the things that we were suggesting were absurd, and the script that I wrote came true. So, it is frustrating to me that when my real world research from following people like Kash Patel and Steve Bannon, when the vast majority of Americans who are not in that bubble don't have to think about it, I bring intelligence to these people in the media or people who served in prior administrations, and they say, they dismiss me. They're like, oh no, this is crazy. But I'm always right about these things. And it is beyond frustrating to see the lack of imagination, because you don't have to imagine, this outrageous future based on nothing. You read like Ruth Ben-Ghiat's book, Strongmen, and you look about all of the absurdities of not just Mussolini and Hitler, but of guys like Gaddafi, right? That was modern era stuff. Saddam Hussein, the absurd things that they used to do to test the loyalty of their own parties. We are seeing Donald Trump do the same thing right now today. And every time that an expert in my field brings this kind of thing up to, what I think most Americans think of as the elite class, they kind of dismiss us as if we're being laughable. But I'm following the work of historians. This isn't make-believe. This is the world we're all living in. And we can either prepare for the most outrageous stuff, or we can continue to be shocked and awed and left dumbfounded and unable to react or respond.
I think that critique you just articulated applies to the media ecosystem as well. And, I've always hated painting with too broad a brush when it comes to media critiques, but for lack of a better term, everyone knows what I'm talking about. The mainstream media just isn't getting it. And they totally missed the ball on this election. And it is really going to be alternative media sources that determine the outcomes going forward. And I just think we need to find a better way to empower the ones that are telling the truth. Not a question in there, but I don't know, react to it, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I'm an avid MSNBC consumer. I, used to be on MSNBC, a few times a month. And I have a very diverse diet, right? Half my day I'm spending in the worst places of the internet reading the farthest right propaganda, right? So I have a very diverse, diet of media, and listening to Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski explain away the fact that they went to Mar-a-Lago and kissed the ring as if they're investigative journalists, and the only way to get to the story is if they're, standing next to Donald Trump eating dinner at Mar-a-Lago or breakfast at Mar-a-Lago, to be fair to them. That is absurd. We watch their response to the loss of Kamala Harris. And in the days following the election, Joe Scarborough, this so-called former arch conservative Republican, is talking about how it was always the trans messaging. It was the they, them stuff. Kamala Harris did not put a trans person on stage at the DNC for the entire 4-day event. There was not one trans person up there. Right? Trans people were excluded from the DNC. Kamala Harris didn't run they, them commercials. The Republicans did. Right? So when we have, what is supposed to be, I think, pretty clearly the alternative to Fox News and MSNBC, and we have hosts like Joe Scarborough going straight to we weren't bigots enough, that's a problem. And you're right. We do need to come up with an alternative way to get progressive, non-bigoted voices out there, because people like Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski, their days have to be in the past. We can't allow them to be the loudest people in the room anymore, because as long as we do that, we're going to keep, sabotaging our allies. We're going to keep compromising our values, when what we should be doing is sticking to the oaths that you and I made to our country and never compromising on our values.
Yep. Well, it's why we do this, Kris. It's why this network exists. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Keep it up.
Thank you, brother.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Meidas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.